Imagine lying down right now, closing your eyes and being gently carried back 2,000 years to a world of marble and olive oil, of bread still warm from stone ovens, of the smell of honey and figs drifting through the morning air of ancient Rome. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything. Just breathe. Just listen. Because tonight, we are going somewhere extraordinary together. We are stepping into the quiet, unhurried mornings of the most powerful civilization the world has ever known. We are going to sit at the breakfast table of ancient Romans, from the humble slave waking before the sun, to the senator stretching in his silk-draped bedroom, to the emperor himself being served by trembling hands in golden rooms. And here is the thing that almost nobody tells you. Roman mornings were not loud. They were not dramatic. They were slow and simple and so beautifully ordinary that by the time this story is finished, you may find yourself wondering whether the Romans had discovered something about the morning and about rest that we have completely forgotten. So close your eyes if you want. Let your body become heavy. Let your breathing slow down just a little, because this is not a story that will rush you anywhere. This is a story that will walk beside you quietly all the way through the Roman morning until sleep finds you as softly as it found them. Stay with me. The city of Rome is about to wake up and you are invited. Let us begin at the very beginning. Not with emperors, not with senators, not with the grand marble steps of the Forum or the thundering crowds of the Colosseum. Let us begin where every Roman morning actually began, in darkness. In the hour before dawn, when the city of Rome was still wrapped in something close to silence, the first sounds were not of trumpets or of roosters, though roosters certainly played their part. The first sounds were of feet, small, bare, careful feet, moving across cold stone floors. These were the feet of the slaves, the men and women and children who existed at the very foundation of Roman society, and whose mornings began long before anyone else was stirring. In a Roman household of any size, and Rome had many thousands of households of every size imaginable, the morning belonged first to the slaves. Their work was the invisible scaffolding upon which the entire day would be built. And their mornings, quiet as they were, are worth understanding, because in understanding how they began their day, we begin to understand what the Romans believed about food, about the body, about the nature of morning itself. The Roman slave whose job it was to prepare the household kitchen would rise when the sky was still completely black. There were no alarm clocks, of course, no glowing screens, no buzzing devices. Instead, the rhythm of waking was governed by something older and more reliable. It was governed by the body itself, trained over years to wake at the same hour, in response to the same internal signal that had been cultivated through simple repetition. This is something the Romans understood intuitively. The body, they believed, was a creature of habit. It responded to regularity the way a plant responds to sunlight. Feed it at the same time, wake it at the same time, rest it at the same time, and it would perform reliably, sustainably, without drama. Modern sleep scientists would find nothing to argue with in that philosophy. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The slave is awake. The kitchen must be prepared. The Roman kitchen, called the culina, was not what we would imagine today. In the homes of ordinary Romans, the kitchen was often a single small room, sometimes not much larger than a closet, with a low stone counter built along one wall, beneath which a fire could be set using charcoal or wood. There was no chimney in many older Roman homes. The smoke drifted upward and escaped through a small opening in the roof or simply accumulated near the ceiling, leaving walls permanently darkened with soot. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii, the city famously frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, have found countless culinae in exactly this condition, their walls stained black, their stone counters worn smooth by 10,000 mornings of work. When you stand in one of those rooms today, even in ruins, even stripped of everything that once filled them, you can feel the intimacy of the space. These were not rooms designed for elaborate performance. They were rooms designed for quiet, efficient, daily work. And the work that happened in them at dawn was almost always the same. The first task was fire. Before anything could be cooked, before anything could even be warmed, fire had to be coaxed into being. This was done using a small clay pot or brazier, into which charcoal was carefully arranged, and then ignited using an ember saved from the previous night's fire. Romans were careful about fire not only because it was dangerous, but because starting a fire from scratch was genuinely difficult and time-consuming. The practice of banking a fire, keeping a small ember alive overnight so it could be used to restart the flame in the morning, was so common and so important that the Romans built an entire mythology around it. The goddess Vesta was the divine protector of the hearth flame. Her temple in the Roman Forum contained a sacred fire that was never allowed to go out, tended by a group of specially chosen priestesses called the Vestal Virgins. If the flame in Vesta's temple died, it was considered a catastrophic omen for the entire city. This was not superstition for its own sake. It was a reflection of how deeply the Romans understood the relationship between fire and life. Without fire, there was no warmth. Without warmth, there was no food. Without food, there was no morning. And without morning, there was nothing at all. Once the fire in the culina was burning steadily, and this might take 15 minutes or half an hour of careful attention, the real work of the morning could begin. And here we come to something remarkable. The Roman breakfast was, by our standards, extraordinarily simple. So simple, in fact, that it might strike a modern person as barely a meal at all. The Romans called breakfast intaculum, a word whose exact origins are slightly debated among scholars but which most believe derives from the Latin for eating in the morning, or more literally, the first taking of food. And what did this first taking of food consist of? In the vast majority of Roman households, for the vast majority of Roman people, intaculum was bread. Just bread, not a banquet of bread. Not a spread of bread accompanied by elaborate toppings and garnishes and imported delicacies. Just bread, eaten quietly, often without even sitting down, in the minutes before the day's real work began. This will surprise many people, because we tend to think of the Romans as an extravagant civilization. We think of their legendary feasts, the triclinia where wealthy Romans reclined on cushioned couches and were served course after elaborate course for hours at a stretch. We think of dormice fattened on nuts and honey, of flamingo tongues and lark's eggs, of wine mixed with seawater or sweetened with the reduced juice of raisins. And all of that is real. All of that existed. But it existed at dinner at the cena, the meal that came late in the afternoon or evening after the day's work was finished. The Roman relationship with food was not uniform across the day. It was deeply stratified. Morning was for simplicity. Morning was for restraint. Morning was, in many ways, almost for fasting. And this philosophy, this ancient Roman understanding that the body waking from sleep does not need to be immediately overwhelmed with rich food, is something that modern nutritional science has spent decades slowly, awkwardly arriving at all over again. But let us stay with the bread, because the bread is worth understanding. Roman bread was not like our bread. It was not the soft, pillowy, preservative-laden loaf that sits in a plastic bag on our kitchen counter. Roman bread was dense. It was made primarily from emmer wheat or spelt, ancient grains that had been cultivated in the Mediterranean basin for thousands of years before Rome became Rome. These grains were harder than modern wheat. They had a chewier texture, a nuttier flavor, a heavier weight in the hand. When you broke a piece of Roman bread, it did not tear softly. It resisted you. It required effort, and this was not considered a flaw. This was considered simply the nature of bread, the way bread was, had always been, and presumably would always be. The process of making this bread began not in the morning but the evening before, or even earlier, in the professional bakeries called pistrina that served much of Rome's urban population. This is another thing that surprises people. We imagine that in ancient times, every household baked its own bread. And while this was true in the countryside, and in the homes of the very poor, much of Rome's urban population, particularly in the densely packed apartment buildings called insulae that housed the city's working classes, did not have kitchens capable of baking bread at all. The insulae were fire hazards. They were tall, crowded, often poorly constructed buildings, where the upper floors might be occupied by dozens of families living in single rooms. Open flames in such places were genuinely dangerous, and many Roman emperors issued regulations limiting what kinds of cooking could be done in them. So Romans who lived in insulae, which was a very large number of Romans indeed, bought their bread. They walked to the nearest pastrina in the early morning and purchased the loaves that had been baking through the night. And the smell of those bakeries, the warm, yeasty, slightly smoky smell of bread baking in stone ovens, would have been one of the defining sensory experiences of the Roman urban morning. Close your eyes and try to imagine it. The streets still dark, or just beginning to lighten at the edges. The air cool and carrying that smell. The sound of the baker's voice calling out the fresh loaves. It is a very human scene. It is the kind of morning that any one of us might have walked through 2,000 years ago, wrapped in a woolen cloak, coins in hand, heading toward that warmth and that smell. The bread itself came in different varieties. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii, where actual carbonized loaves have been found and preserved by the volcanic ash, tells us a great deal about what Roman bread looked like. The most common type was a round, flat loaf divided into 8 equal segments by scored lines across the top, almost like a modern focaccia, though considerably denser. These loaves were of a convenient size to be carried under one arm. They could be eaten by one person over the course of a morning, or shared among several. The segments made it easy to break off a portion without a knife, which was practical, since not everyone carried a knife, and not everyone had a table to cut bread on. Some people ate their morning bread standing in the street outside the bakery. Some carried it home. Some ate it while walking to wherever they needed to go. This was not considered rude or improper. This was simply how Romans ate in the morning. Breakfast was not a ceremony. It was not a ritual. It was a practical necessity, accomplished as efficiently as possible so that the day could begin. Now, bread alone, even dense and nutritious Roman bread, was not always all that Romans ate for breakfast. There were accompaniments, and these accompaniments tell us something enormously interesting about Roman taste, Roman priorities, and the Roman understanding of what the body needed in the morning. The most common breakfast accompaniment, mentioned again and again in Roman texts, was cheese. Specifically, a soft, fresh cheese similar to what we might call cottage cheese or ricotta today, made from sheep's milk or goat's milk. Sheep and goats were far more common in the Roman world than cows. The climate of the Mediterranean, hot and dry for much of the year, was better suited to the hardier animals, and sheep's milk in particular was prized for its richness, its high fat content, its ability to make a cheese that was dense, satisfying, slightly salty, with a flavor that paired perfectly with the earthiness of emmer bread. Romans would spread this cheese on their bread, or dip the bread into it, or simply eat both together in alternating bites. It was simple. It was filling. It required almost no preparation, and it provided the kind of sustained energy that would carry a working person through several hours of labor without flagging. The second most common breakfast accompaniment was olives. Olives are so central to Mediterranean life, and to Roman civilization specifically, that it is almost impossible to overstate their importance. The olive tree was sacred. It was ancient. It was the tree under which, according to legend, the goddess Minerva had won her patronage of Athens by offering its fruit to the people. The Romans inherited this reverence for the olive entirely. They planted olive groves across every territory they conquered, from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the Rhine Valley. They pressed olive oil in quantities that seem staggering even today, and they ate olives at every meal in every form, prepared in every way imaginable. At breakfast, the olives were usually simple. They might be plain, cured in brine, slightly salty, with that particular Mediterranean bitterness that lingers pleasantly on the tongue. Or they might be dressed with a little oil and a pinch of herbs, oregano or thyme or rosemary growing wild on the hillsides outside the city. Either way, they were eaten alongside the bread, in small quantities, not as a main component of the meal but as a flavor, a punctuation, a reminder of the landscape in which the Roman world existed. And then there was honey. Roman honey was extraordinary. It came from hives kept across the Italian peninsula and the wider empire, and different regions produced honey of quite different characters. The honey of Attica in Greece, flavored by the thyme that grew wild across the Attic hills, was considered by Roman gourmands to be among the finest in the world. The honey of Sicily, golden and thick, was also highly prized. Romans ate honey in the morning by spreading it on their bread, by drizzling it over their cheese, by stirring it into a cup of warm water or wine. It was both food and medicine in the Roman understanding. Honey was believed to aid digestion, to strengthen the stomach, to calm the body after sleep. Roman physicians, most notably Galen, the great physician of the 2nd century AD who served as personal doctor to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wrote extensively about the properties of honey and recommended it for a wide variety of ailments. And this instinct was not wrong. We know now that honey contains antimicrobial properties, natural sugars for quick energy, and various trace compounds that support immune function. The Romans did not know why honey worked, but they knew that it did, and so they ate it in the morning quietly with their bread in the slow dawn light of 2,000 years ago. There were also figs. Fresh figs in summer, dried figs preserved through the winter. The fig was another ancient and sacred tree in the Roman world. According to legend, the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, had rested beneath a fig tree, the famous Ficus ruminalis, which stood near the Lupercal cave on the Palatine Hill, and was tended as a sacred object for centuries. To eat a fig in Rome was to eat something that carried the weight of the city's oldest mythology. Whether ordinary Romans thought about this while eating their morning figs is doubtful. But the cultural resonance was there, woven into the background of daily life in the way that certain foods always carry more meaning than their simple nutritional value suggests. Dried figs were sweet and dense, full of natural sugars and fiber, easy to carry, easy to eat. A handful of dried figs eaten with bread and cheese was a complete, sustaining breakfast that cost very little and required no cooking at all. It was the perfect Roman morning meal. Now, we have been speaking so far primarily about what ordinary Romans ate for breakfast. The majority of the population, the workers and the slaves and the small merchants, and the craftsmen who made up the vast, living, breathing body of the city. But Rome was also a city of enormous wealth and enormous inequality. And while the simple breakfast of bread and olives and cheese sustained the working majority, the upper classes had their own relationship with the morning meal, one that was both more elaborate and, in certain ways, more complicated. A wealthy Roman of the senatorial class, a man or woman of significant property and social standing, did not simply stumble out of bed and grab a piece of bread from a basket. Their morning was a performance, a carefully choreographed sequence of social rituals that began even before food was involved. And to understand their breakfast, we have to understand their morning, which began with something called the salutatio. The salutatio was one of the most distinctive institutions of Roman aristocratic life. Every morning, from roughly the first or second hour of the day, which depending on the season might correspond to anywhere from 6 to 8 in the morning by our reckoning, the house of a wealthy Roman patron would be open to visitors. These visitors were called clients, and they came to pay their respects to the patron, to ask for favors, to maintain the relationship that gave the client access to the patron's protection, influence, and occasional financial support. In return, the patron received a demonstration of his importance, a visible measure of his social standing expressed in the number of people who showed up at his door every single morning. Some very powerful patrons might receive dozens or even hundreds of clients in a single morning salutatio. A senator at the height of his influence might have clients who traveled across the city through the early morning darkness to arrive at his doorstep before he had even washed his face. And this is where breakfast gets interesting in the wealthy Roman household. Because the patron, having received his clients, having dispensed his advice and his favors, would sometimes offer them something to eat. This was called the sportula, literally a little basket. In earlier periods of Roman history, the sportula had been an actual basket of food, given to clients as a token of the patron's generosity. In later periods, particularly during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the sportula was sometimes replaced with a small cash payment. But in some households, the tradition of actual food was maintained. A client might leave his patron's house in the morning with a portion of bread, some olives, perhaps a small piece of dried fish. This was his payment for his attendance, his acknowledgement that the relationship between patron and client was reciprocal, that social bonds were maintained not only through words, but through the most basic of human transactions, the sharing of food. Inside the wealthy house, after the salutatio was complete and the last of the clients had departed, the patron and his family would finally have their own breakfast. And here, the meal began to look a little more elaborate, though never approaching the opulence of the evening cena. A prosperous Roman breakfast might include, in addition to bread and cheese and olives, some small sweet cakes made from spelt flour, eggs, and honey. These cakes, called placenta in Latin, were a kind of flat, layered pastry that could be prepared the previous evening and eaten cold in the morning, or warmed briefly on the household brazier. They were rich and sweet and quite delicious by all accounts, and they were considered a modest luxury, the kind of thing that marked the morning of a person of some means, without crossing into the kind of excess that the Romans associated with moral corruption. Eggs were also a regular feature of the wealthier Roman breakfast. The Romans were extraordinarily fond of eggs. They kept chickens in their homes, in the gardens of their townhouses, in the farmyards of their country estates. Boiled eggs were common. Fried eggs, cooked in olive oil in a small clay pan, were also eaten. There is even evidence of a kind of scrambled egg preparation, eggs beaten together with a little garum, the famous fermented fish sauce that served as the Romans' all-purpose condiment and seasoning, and then cooked slowly in oil until just set. Garum, which sounds alarming to modern ears, was actually not unlike the fish sauces used throughout Southeast Asian cuisine today, and the Romans considered it as essential to food as we consider salt. It was salty, deeply savory, intensely flavored, and used in extraordinarily small quantities to add depth to almost everything. A scrambled egg touched with garum and eaten with warm bread, and a cup of diluted wine was, by the standards of any civilization in any era, a perfectly good breakfast. Wine. Yes, the Romans drank wine at breakfast. This is perhaps the detail that most surprises modern people when they first encounter it. We have been raised on a set of associations between breakfast and certain drinks, coffee, tea, orange juice, milk, and the idea of drinking wine in the morning strikes us as either irresponsible or faintly dissolute. But in the Roman world, the situation was entirely different, and once you understand the Roman relationship with wine, it begins to make perfect sense. To begin with, the Romans almost never drank wine undiluted. Drinking unmixed wine, called merum, was considered barbaric, the behavior of uncivilized peoples who did not know how to properly conduct a meal. Civilized Romans mixed their wine with water, sometimes in ratios of 1 part wine to 2 or even 3 parts water. This meant that a Roman cup of wine in the morning contained far less alcohol than even a modern glass of wine. It was more like a very lightly flavored, slightly caloric drink, providing hydration, some energy from the natural sugars, and a flavor that was far more palatable than plain water in a world where water quality was inconsistent and sometimes dangerous. The Romans also had access to pasca, a drink made from vinegar and water, which sounds deeply unpleasant but was apparently quite refreshing, and was particularly associated with Roman soldiers on campaign, who found it more stable and safer to drink than water from unknown sources. Pasca was consumed in the mornings by working people and soldiers, providing hydration without the caloric content of wine, and with the added benefit of vinegar's mild antimicrobial properties. We might think of it as the Roman equivalent of a sports drink, practical, functional, consumed without pleasure but with purpose. The Roman senator or wealthy merchant, however, would likely start his morning with a small cup of wine properly diluted, perhaps flavored with a little honey or with a few drops of rose water, and served in a fine pottery cup, or, if he was very wealthy, in a cup of silver or glass. Glass blowing had been introduced to the Roman world from the eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century BC, and by the imperial period had produced a flourishing industry of blown glass vessels that were beautiful, fragile, and a very effective status symbol. To drink your morning wine from a glass cup was to announce something about who you were in the Roman social hierarchy. These were not subtle people, the Romans. They understood that objects communicated meaning, and they chose their objects accordingly. We should speak now about children, because the Roman morning was not only an adult affair, and the question of what Roman children ate for breakfast is both interesting and touching. Roman children were expected to eat essentially the same things as adults, but in smaller quantities and with certain allowances for preference and digestion. Very young children, infants and toddlers, were primarily breastfed, and Roman medical writers were quite specific about the proper duration and method of breastfeeding. The great physician Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century AD, recommended that infants be breastfed for up to 2 years, and prescribed a careful diet for the nursing mother to ensure the quality of her milk. But as children grew older and began to eat solid food, they joined the household at the morning meal and ate what was available. Children seem to have had particular affection for sweet things, which is, of course, not surprising. The Roman equivalent of a treat for a child at breakfast might be a small piece of honeyed bread, or a dried fig, or one of the sweet spelt cakes that were also enjoyed by adults. There is a charming passage in the writings of the Roman satirist Martial, writing in the late 1st century AD, in which he describes the smells and sounds of the Roman city morning, including the voices of schoolmasters teaching their students in the early hours. Roman schools often began very early, before sunrise, and the image of small children being hurried through their morning bread and cheese in the pre-dawn darkness before being dispatched to the grammaticus is both universal in its recognizability and deeply specific to the Roman world. Children have always been reluctant to eat before they are fully awake. Parents have always insisted. This particular negotiation is perhaps the oldest constant in human family life. Let us think now about the Roman soldier, because the soldier's morning was a world entirely apart from both the civilian's simple breakfast and the aristocrat's more leisurely ritual. The Roman legionary was one of the most rigorously trained and disciplined fighting men in the ancient world, and his physical condition was considered a matter of state importance. He ate, slept, trained, and maintained himself according to regulations that had been refined over centuries of military experience. His morning meal, therefore, was not left to personal preference. It was prescribed. The Roman legionary's entaculum was heavy. It had to be. A man who would spend the morning drilling with sword and shield, or marching 20 miles in full armor, needed more fuel than a senator attending to correspondence. The soldier's breakfast typically included a substantial portion of bread, made from wheat that the legion carried with it and ground and baked in camp ovens. The bread was hard, practical, long-lasting. It was not the artisanal loaf of the city bakery. It was bread designed to sustain men under extreme physical stress in all conditions, and it did its job admirably. With this bread came a ration of salt, of enormous practical importance in a world before refrigeration, and sometimes a portion of dried or salted meat, most commonly pork but occasionally beef or mutton, depending on what was available in the territory through which the legion was passing. The Roman army was also fond of lard and rendered fat, spread on bread as a source of concentrated calories, and this practice was practical enough that it persisted in various forms in European military provisioning all the way into the modern era. Soldiers' bodies require fat. Long marches burn through energy reserves at a rate that simple carbohydrates cannot sustain alone. The Romans, through long empirical experience, understood this, even if they articulated it not in the language of macronutrients, but in the simpler language of what made men strong enough to do what was required of them. In permanent legionary fortresses, the great stone-built camps called castra that Rome established at strategic points across the empire, the morning meal was a more organized affair. The legionaries ate in their contubernium, their tent group of 8 men who lived, fought, and ate together. They cooked collectively, sharing the labor and the food, which created bonds of loyalty and familiarity that were, from the military perspective, exactly as valuable as the nutritional content of the meal itself. Men who have eaten together, shared the small rituals of preparing food and sitting down to eat, are men who will fight for each other. The Roman army understood this intuitively and built its entire social structure around these small units of shared domestic life. Now let us travel across the empire, because Rome was not only a city. Rome was a world. At its height, the Roman Empire encompassed territories from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Sahara Desert to the steppes north of the Black Sea. And while Roman culture was remarkably consistent in its broad outlines across this vast geography, local conditions and local food traditions inevitably shaped how Romans, or Romanized populations, actually ate in the morning. In Egypt, which Rome absorbed in 30 BC after the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the Roman morning meal was influenced by centuries of Egyptian food tradition. Egyptians had been eating bread for longer than Rome had existed as a city. Egyptian bread, made from emmer wheat or barley, was a fundamental component of Egyptian civilization going back to the age of the pharaohs. When Roman administrators and soldiers settled in Egypt, they brought their own food preferences but found themselves also adopting local habits. Dates were common in Egypt in a way they were not in Italy, and a Roman colonist in Alexandria might well eat dates with his morning bread in a way that his counterpart in Rome would not. Chickpeas, ground into a paste or simply boiled and eaten warm, were also part of the Egyptian breakfast tradition and found their way onto Roman tables in that territory. In Gaul, the vast territory of modern France and parts of neighboring countries, which Julius Caesar had conquered in a series of campaigns in the 50s BC, the Romanization of food habits was a fascinating and sometimes contentious process. The Gauls had their own food traditions, their own bread-making practices, their own ways of beginning the morning, and while they adopted many Roman customs as Romanization proceeded, they also retained certain distinctively Gallic habits. The Gauls, for instance, were already making a variety of fermented grain drinks that were not wine, but were produced through broadly similar processes of fermentation, and these drinks remained part of the Gallic morning table even as Roman wine spread through the territory. A Romanized Gaul in the 1st century AD might eat Roman-style bread with Roman-style cheese, but wash it down with something closer to a thin fermented grain drink that his Roman-born neighbor in Lyon would have wrinkled his nose at. In Britain, which Rome invaded in 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius, and occupied in various degrees for nearly 4 centuries afterward, the collision of Roman and native British food cultures produced its own fascinating results. The native Britons, the Celtic peoples who inhabited the island, had a diet based heavily on grain porridge, on root vegetables, on game, on the products of cattle herding. When Roman troops and administrators arrived, they brought with them the desire for Roman food and the difficulty of obtaining it in a cold, wet, northern island that did not naturally support olive trees or the wine grape. Archaeological excavations of Roman military sites in Britain, places like Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, have yielded extraordinary evidence of Roman food habits in this unlikely setting. The writing tablets found at Vindolanda, thin wooden slices inscribed with everyday correspondence by soldiers and administrators, mention food constantly. Requests for more Celtic beer, orders for olive oil, complaints about the quality of local provisions, notes about what was available at the market. One tablet contains what appears to be a list of provisions received, including grain, sour wine, and a kind of fish sauce. The Roman legionaries' garum even here, at the very edge of the known world, still present on the table. We should also speak of the Roman attitude toward the morning itself. Not just the food of the morning, but the time, the quality of early hours, and what the Romans believed those hours were for. Because the Roman relationship with time was different from ours in ways that are subtle but important. The Romans divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but these were not fixed hours of 60 minutes as ours are. They were proportional hours, their length varying with the season. In summer, when the days were long, the 12 hours of daylight were each longer than 60 modern minutes. In winter, they were shorter. This meant that the first hour of the Roman day was not a fixed point on a universal clock, but a relative moment, always the first twelfth of available daylight, always the beginning. And the Romans felt that this beginning deserved a certain kind of attention. The first hour was considered by many Roman writers and philosophers to be the most valuable of the day. It was the hour of sharpest thought, of clearest perception, of greatest possibility. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose private journal, known to us as the Meditations, is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world, begins several entries with reflections on the difficulty of waking in the morning and the importance of doing so properly. He argues with himself about the temptation to remain in bed, noting that even a pleasant bed is ultimately just a bed, and that the purpose for which one is made is to get up and do the work of being human. This is a man writing to himself, in private, at the end of the 2nd century AD, about the same struggle that every person with a smartphone and an alarm clock faces every single morning. The Roman emperor and the modern sleeper are, in this particular moment, exactly the same. The Stoic philosophers who so deeply influenced Roman intellectual life had a great deal to say about morning. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had been born a slave and became one of the most influential teachers of his age, taught his students to begin the morning with a mental rehearsal of the day ahead, to anticipate difficulties, to prepare the mind for whatever the hours might bring. This practice, which the Stoics called the morning meditation or the premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, sounds grim but was actually a form of psychological resilience training, a way of ensuring that nothing the day threw at you would catch you entirely unprepared. And this practice was done before eating. The Stoics, like many Roman thinkers, believed that the mind was sharpest before food, that eating, while necessary, also produced a kind of heaviness in the mind, a slight blunting of intellectual edge. This is not, interestingly, entirely without scientific basis. There is evidence that light meals support better cognitive function than heavy ones, and that the body's post-digestive processes can indeed produce a mild soporific effect. The Romans called this post-meal sleepiness the post-cibum torpor, and they were particularly careful about it in the context of the morning, which they wanted to preserve as a time of mental clarity and purpose. The philosophical schools of Rome had various prescriptions about how the morning should be conducted. The Epicureans, who sought pleasure and the absence of pain as the highest goods, tended to take a more relaxed view. Epicurus himself had famously declared that a man could be perfectly happy on bread and water, and that he could give pleasure to any feast by inviting need to it as his guest. His Roman followers, including the poet Horace and the philosopher Lucretius, reflected this perspective in their writings, often describing simple morning meals with genuine pleasure and even a kind of philosophical contentment. There is a beautiful passage in Horace's satires where he describes sitting down to a simple meal of onions and flatbread and a little porridge, and finding in this simplicity not deprivation but freedom. The person who needs little is the person who fears nothing. And the morning, with its simple bread and its olive oil and its small cup of watered wine, was the daily practice of this philosophical principle. Let us think now about those who were very poor, because Rome's poverty was as extreme as its wealth, and the morning experience of the truly destitute was dramatically different from anything we have discussed so far. Rome had a class of people called the proletarii, literally those who produced only offspring, those who had nothing to offer the state except their children. These were the people at the very bottom of the economic hierarchy, and their morning meal, if they had one at all, was shaped entirely by what they could obtain for free or at the cheapest possible price. The Roman state had long recognized the political dangers of a hungry urban population and had established a system of grain distribution, the annona, through which free or heavily subsidized grain was provided to Roman citizens who registered for it. At its height, during the imperial period, hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens received a monthly grain allocation as a matter of right. This grain could be ground into flour and made into bread, or it could be cooked as a kind of porridge, called puls, which was actually one of the oldest and most deeply traditional Roman foods. Puls predated bread in the Roman diet. It was the food of Rome's earliest, simplest days, when the city was still a small collection of communities on the hills above the Tiber, and the sophisticated bread-baking technology of the later Republic had not yet been developed. Made from spelt or emmer wheat or millet, boiled in water until thick, puls was a filling, warming, entirely adequate food that required nothing but grain, water, and heat. In its earliest, plainest form, it was as simple as any food could be. But like all simple foods, it admitted of elaboration. A spoonful of olive oil stirred in, a little salt, a handful of dried herbs, a few olives on the side, a fragment of hard cheese crumbled over the top. Even the simplest puls could become, with small additions, something genuinely satisfying. And for many Romans, particularly in the cold months of the year, a bowl of warm puls eaten in the early morning was the best breakfast imaginable. Not because it was luxurious, but because it was warm and filling and present at the beginning of another difficult day. The grain dole, the annona, was collected from distribution points called the porticus minutia, and the lines that formed at these points in the early morning were one of the characteristic sights of imperial Rome. Men and their families would queue in the pre-dawn darkness to collect their monthly ration, then carry it home through the still quiet streets. The image is both ancient and entirely familiar. People waiting in line for food at the beginning of the day in a city that is not yet fully awake. This scene has repeated itself in every civilization, in every century, in every part of the world. It is one of the most human of all human activities, and the Romans who stood in those lines were not diminished by doing so. They were, like all people in all times who simply do what must be done to get through the morning, just getting through the morning. Now we should speak of the market, the macelum, and the role it played in the Roman morning. Because while some Romans ate only what their own households produced, and while the grain dole provided for the very poor, the majority of urban Romans were consumers, people who purchased their food from the vibrant, noisy, extraordinarily diverse markets that operated every morning throughout the city. The macelum was a covered food market, a large building with a central courtyard and shops arranged around the perimeter, each selling different categories of food. Fish from the Tiber and from the sea, though Roman urban fish increasingly had to be brought from considerable distances as local stocks were depleted. Meat from cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. Vegetables of extraordinary variety, far greater variety than many people realize, because the Romans were skilled and enthusiastic horticulturalists who cultivated dozens of vegetable species, and prepared foods, already cooked and ready to eat, sold from small stalls and shops called thermopolia that operated at the street level throughout the city. The thermopolium, of which the plural is thermopolia, was essentially the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter. It consisted of a stone counter with large ceramic vessels, called dolia, set into it. These vessels kept food warm, heated from below by coals or hot water. Customers could purchase portions of cooked food directly from the counter, eating standing up in the street or sitting on small benches if they were provided. The thermopolia of Pompeii, preserved in extraordinary detail by the volcanic ash, show us exactly what these establishments looked like, and excavations have revealed residue of actual food in some of the dolia. Analysis of this residue has identified a range of ingredients including duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, beans, and various nuts and grains. A thermopolium in the morning might sell warm puls, or boiled legumes, or simply bread that had been kept warm, providing a quick, inexpensive breakfast for workers on their way to the forum or the workshop or the construction site. The thermopolium was, by all evidence, a deeply social space as well as a practical one. People gathered there not only to eat but to talk, to exchange news, to see and be seen. The Roman city was an intensely social place, and the morning's early hours, when the streets were just beginning to fill, and the day had not yet fully committed to its noise and rush, were a time when these social rituals of the market and the food stall had a particular warmth and intimacy. We know from Roman graffiti, preserved on the walls of Pompeii in astonishing abundance, that people knew their food stall operators by name, that regular customers had regular spots and regular orders, and that the exchange of food and money was embedded in a web of relationship and familiarity that made the simple act of buying breakfast into something considerably richer than a mere transaction. Let us move now into the interior of the Roman home more deeply, into the bedroom itself, where the morning began before even the first thought of food. The Roman bedroom, called the cubiculum, was typically a small, dark room, its one window often shuttered against the night air, which Romans universally believed to be unhealthy and dangerous. The Roman night was cold in ways we do not experience in our temperature-controlled homes. Even in the mild climate of central Italy, winter nights could be genuinely bitter, and the Romans layered themselves in wool for sleeping. Wealthy Romans had thick woolen blankets, sometimes stuffed with the kind of natural wool filling that served as insulation. The poor made do with thinner coverings and stayed warmer by sleeping in smaller spaces, and sometimes sharing body heat with family members or other occupants of the same room. Waking in a Roman bedroom was, for much of the year, waking into cold. The fire in the brazier might have kept some heat in the room through the night, but by the small hours of the morning it would have died down to embers, and the room would have cooled significantly. This physical experience of cold at waking was one of the universal daily experiences of Roman life, something that rich and poor alike shared, though the wealthy could respond to it more quickly, with warm water brought by slaves and warm clothing ready at hand. The poor simply shivered and got up and got moving, because movement was the fastest cure for cold that required no additional resources. Water was the first order of business for many Romans after waking. Not drinking water, initially, but washing water. The Romans placed great importance on personal cleanliness in the morning. They washed their faces and hands before anything else, and this morning ablution was not considered optional, but was a fundamental part of the transition from the state of sleep to the state of wakefulness. Cold water was used in summer, or warm water brought and heated in the kitchen by the household slaves in winter. The wealthy had small basins called puls, ceramic or bronze, which were placed in the cubiculum for this purpose. The poor made do with whatever vessel was available, and after washing, the morning could properly begin. Teeth. We might wonder about teeth. The Romans did clean their teeth, though their methods would strike us as unconventional. Roman tooth powder was typically made from abrasive materials including crushed bone, oyster shell, chalk, and various mineral compounds. Some Roman tooth cleaning preparations included urine, which sounds appalling but is chemically logical, as the ammonia in urine is a mild cleaning agent, and the Romans had discovered this property empirically. The poet Catullus makes an unflattering reference to a person who used Spanish urine, apparently considered particularly potent, to clean their teeth, which suggests both that the practice was known and that it was considered faintly ridiculous when taken to extremes. After these morning ablutions, the Roman was ready for food. And now, having followed the Roman morning from darkness to the first light, having seen the slaves lighting the kitchen fire and the baker sliding loaves from the stone oven, and the client hurrying through the pre-dawn streets to the patron's door, and the soldier receiving his bread ration in the camp courtyard, and the poor family collecting their grain dole at the porticus minutia. Having sat with the wealthy senator at his morning table, and the philosopher contemplating the day ahead, and the child being hurried to school with a fig in one hand and a piece of bread in the other, let us think about what all of this adds up to. What do these Roman mornings tell us, 2,000 years later, lying here in the quiet? They tell us first, that the morning has always been a negotiation between the desire to remain in the warmth and ease of sleep and the demand of the day, between the needs of the body and the expectations of the world. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, richest and most powerful man in the world, was not exempt from this negotiation. He had to argue with himself about getting up. He had to remind himself in his private journal why it was worth doing. And if that does not make you feel less alone in your own mornings, nothing will. They tell us, second, that simple food has always been enough. The Roman morning did not need to be elaborate to be sustaining. Bread, cheese, a few olives, a drizzle of honey. These were not foods of deprivation. They were foods of civilization, chosen by a culture that had thought very carefully about what the body needed and had arrived at a simple, satisfying answer. We live in an age of extraordinary food abundance and extraordinary food anxiety, and perhaps there is something peaceful in the Roman example. Eat what is simple. Eat what is real. Eat it quietly without making too much of it and then get on with the day. They tell us, third, that the social texture of the morning matters as much as its practical content. The client coming to the patron's door, the neighbors meeting at the thermopolium, the soldiers eating together in their tent group, the family sharing bread in the kitchen before the children run to school. These moments of morning connection were not incidental to Roman life. They were the substance of it. They were how the city held itself together, how relationships were maintained, how trust was built and sustained across years and decades. The food was the medium. The connection was the message. And they tell us, finally, something about time itself. The Roman morning was slow. Not slow in the sense of lazy or purposeless, but slow in the sense of deliberate, unhurried, attentive to its own rhythms. The fire was built carefully. The bread was eaten without rushing. The ablutions were performed as a conscious transition from sleep to wakefulness. There was a quality of intention in the Roman morning that our own mornings, with their alarms and their notifications and their coffee consumed while standing over the sink and their breakfast eaten, if at all, while looking at a screen, often lack. The Romans did not have more time than we do. They had the same 24 hours that we have. But they spent those morning hours differently, and in a way that many of us, lying here now in the quiet, might recognize as something we miss, something we are perhaps searching for, even if we cannot quite name what it is. The city of Rome is quieting now. The bakeries have done their work. The thermopolia have served their first customers. The patron has received his clients and dismissed them. The soldier has eaten his bread and taken up his shield. The philosopher has completed his morning meditation. The child has arrived, slightly late, at the schoolmaster's door. The slave in the kitchen has banked the fire again against the evening's needs. And across the enormous, ancient, endlessly fascinating city, 2 million people have made it through another Roman morning. One more day begun in the simplest and most human of ways, with bread and fire, and the gradual brightening of the sky above the 7 hills. Let the Roman morning settle around you now like a warm cloak. Let its slowness, its simplicity, its remarkable ordinariness become the quality of this moment. You have traveled 2,000 years and come back again, and the journey has cost you nothing but a little time, and given you, perhaps, something worth carrying. The morning will come again, as it always does, as it did for the Romans, as it does for everyone who has ever lived under a sky. But for now, there is only this quiet, only this darkness, only the distant, almost imagined smell of warm bread from a stone oven 2 millennia away. Let it carry you. Let your breathing slow. Let the city of Rome grow soft and far and gentle at the edges of your awareness. You are safe. You are warm. The morning is not yet here, and sleep, like the Roman night, is patient and generous and close.